If you believe in destiny and stories of enduring love, like this video and subscribe to the channel now. New and original tales of romance are shared here every day, each more heartwarming than the last. Early autumn had settled over the city with a quiet, reflective air, the kind that made apartment windows glow against the cooling evenings and turned ordinary streets into backdrops for private turning points. Inside one of those apartments, a marriage moved through its days with the calm surface of routine and the silent undercurrent of questions neither of them had yet found the courage to voice. They had been married for a few years, long enough for the first rush of passion to soften into something steadier, but not always gentler. To the world, they looked stable, bills paid, schedules aligned, polite smiles at family gatherings. Yet beneath those images, she carried a weight she could not name without feeling foolish. She loved him deeply, had never doubted that part, but lately she had begun to doubt something more painful, that she truly mattered to him, that her presence changed his day in any real way. He was a quiet man by nature, reserved and self-contained. His calm steadiness had once made her feel anchored in a world that moved too fast. Over time, though, that same quiet began to feel less like peace and more like distance. He came home tired, offered short answers, retreated quickly into screens or emails. When she shared stories from her day, his eyes flickered with attention, but the words she longed to hear never seemed to come. From his side, nothing felt broken. He believed that working hard, staying faithful, and keeping their life stable were proof enough of his devotion. Grand declarations had never been part of his upbringing. Love, as he understood it, lived in what you did, not what you said. He filled her gas tank, fixed things before they broke, left the last slice of cake for her without comment. In his mind, these quiet habits were obvious answers to any doubt she might have, but she needed something different. She needed to hear that she was loved and wanted and seen, not just through acts of service, but through the affirmation of spoken truth. She tried, gently at first, to explain this. On quiet evenings she would ask how he felt about them, about their marriage, about her. He would answer with a practical calm, "We're fine, everything is okay." To him, those words were reassurance. To her, they were a confirmation of her fear that his heart had gone quiet. Small disappointments accumulated like dust in corners, easy to ignore until the light hit them just right. He missed an important date she had mentioned twice. She stopped asking him to join her on walks after dinner because he so often said he was tired. They still shared a bed, still shared a life, but something essential had shifted. She began to feel like a guest in his routines rather than a partner in his dreams. The turning point came on a rainy evening when the sound of water against the windows made the apartment feel smaller than ever. Dinner had been quiet. The dishes sat unwashed in the sink. He scrolled absently through his phone while she sat at the edge of the couch and hands folded in her lap, gathering the last of her courage. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. She told him she no longer felt important to him, that she felt like anyone could be sitting where she was, and his life would go on exactly the same. Her words stunned him. He stared at her, confusion and hurt flickering across his usually controlled expression. He insisted she was wrong, that of course she mattered, that he didn't understand how she could doubt that. But when she asked him to explain why, to tell her what she meant to him, he found himself unable to assemble the feelings into sentences. Panic tightened his throat. The more he struggled, the more her eyes dimmed with resignation. The observer of destiny knew that this was not the death of love, but the beginning of a dangerous misunderstanding. She mistook his silence for absence of feeling. He mistook her plea for accusation. Neither realized that the problem was not a lack of love, but a lack of language for it. Yet in that moment, all she felt was an emptiness too heavy to keep carrying. And in the days that followed, the distance between them would begin to harden into something far more difficult to undo. The days that followed unfolded with the quiet heaviness of a storm that refuses to break. They moved around each other carefully, polite but distant, like neighbors sharing a hallway instead of partners sharing a life. She slept less, waking in the early hours with thoughts circling endlessly. If she mattered, why did it feel like she was invisible? If he loved her, why did it seem impossible for him to say so? Doubt has a way of rewriting memory, and soon even their happiest moments began to feel uncertain in her mind, as if she had misread them all along. He sensed the shift, but could not grasp its depth. To him, the conversation had been painful, but temporary. He believed time would calm her fears the way it always had. Instead, time sharpened them. She began to withdraw in small ways, answering questions with short replies, declining to share plans, defaulting to politeness instead of warmth. He noticed, grew frustrated, then hid the frustration under a mask of composure. Conflict, he believed, only made things worse. So he avoided it, not seeing that avoidance was the very thing widening the divide. One evening, a disagreement that should have been minor, plans cancelled, expectations missed, turned into the reckoning neither had been ready to face. She confessed that she had reached a point where staying felt like slowly erasing herself. The words landed like a blow. He tried to explain that he worked, stayed, provided, that he thought that was the definition of commitment. But when she asked once more how he felt about her, the language still refused to come. What she heard was emptiness. What he felt was paralysis. The decision to separate was not loud. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just a conversation that ended with tears and exhaustion, with her packing quietly, believing she was choosing self-preservation, and him letting her go because he thought anything he said now would only sound forced. The observer of destiny saw the tragedy clearly, two hearts walking away, not because love had died, but because it had never learned how to speak in a way both could understand. After she left, silence took on a different weight. The apartment, once full of routine, felt echoing and unfamiliar. He moved through his days mechanically, convincing himself it had been inevitable, that perhaps she needed someone more expressive, and he was incapable of becoming that man. Yet at night, when distractions faded, he felt the ache of every small memory, the way she laughed when surprised, the warmth of her presence in the kitchen, the comfort of knowing someone saw him even when he said nothing. Regret arrived slowly, like a tide he could not hold back. She, meanwhile, tried to rebuild. Friends reassured her that she had done the right thing, that no one should stay where they feel unseen. She nodded, but when she was alone, grief rose sharply. She had not stopped loving him. She had simply stopped believing that love mattered to him. She went through boxes of shared belongings, choosing what to keep, what to discard, what to leave behind. It was during one of those long afternoons of sorting that she stumbled across the letter. It had been tucked between books at the back of a shelf, an envelope with her name written in his careful handwriting. For a moment, she assumed it was old, perhaps from an early anniversary. Still, curiosity guided her to sit down and open it. The pages inside were not polished or poetic. They were raw. He had written about his fear of saying the wrong thing and ruining everything, about growing up in a home where emotions were implied rather than spoken, where love meant fixing problems, not naming feelings. He wrote about how deeply he cared for her, how often he noticed the way she brightened a room, how grateful he was for her patience, even when he failed to acknowledge it. There, in ink he had never intended to share, she saw the love she had believed was missing. He admitted he wrote instead of speaking because the words tangled in his throat, because vulnerability frightened him, because he worried that if he tried to express everything, it would come out wrong and hurt her more. Reading the letter felt like opening a secret room in their history, one where all the affection she had longed for had quietly existed, only hidden. Tears blurred the page as truth collided painfully with memory. She realized that what she had taken as indifference had been, in part, fear and inexperience with emotional expression. The observer of destiny understood the lesson unfolding. Sometimes the greatest obstacle is not a lack of love, but the inability to translate it. She closed the letter carefully, hands trembling, and felt a new resolve forming, not fueled by guilt or desperation, but by clarity. She decided to try again, not to undo the past, but to confront it honestly. When she reached out to him, her message was simple. She told him she had found the letter. She told him she finally understood that he had loved her all along, even if imperfectly. And she asked if they could talk, not about blame, but about whether love, now seen for what it truly was, might deserve another chance. He hesitated. Old defenses rose immediately. Shame, regret, the fear of failing her again, all of it pressed in. Yet beneath the fear, something else stirred, hope that perhaps the love he had never learned to speak might still find its voice if given one more opportunity. And destiny, attentive and patient, prepared the stage for the conversation that would decide whether silence would remain their ending or become the bridge back to one another. The day they finally agreed to meet was clear and cool, the kind of early spring afternoon that made the city feel both exposed and full of possibility. They chose a small park they used to pass by together, but rarely entered, a place that had once belonged to the background of their life and now would hold the weight of their future. He arrived early, hands buried in his pockets, rehearsing sentences that fell apart the moment he tried to attach feeling to them. He wondered if he should have refused, if seeing her again would only make the loss sharper. But beneath the anxiety was something undeniable. He wanted to see her, to hear what she had to say, to finally face the version of himself reflected in her eyes. She approached more slowly, letter folded carefully in her bag, heartbeat loud in her chest. The weeks since she had found it had reshaped her understanding of their entire marriage. Moments she'd labeled as cold now appeared tinged with a different color. Shyness, fear, effort he didn't know how to name. The pain of feeling unseen hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. Now it shared space with regret for having walked away without realizing what he had been carrying in silence. The observer of destiny watched as they came to stand a few steps apart. Two people who had been intimate for years and yet felt like strangers in this new, fragile context. He spoke first, voice quiet, almost rough. He asked if she was okay, as if the concern could act as a buffer against everything else. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out the letter, holding it between them like a piece of evidence and a lifeline at once. She told him she had found it by accident, that she had read it 3 times in one sitting, that it had broken her heart in a different way than their separation had. Not because it hurt to know he loved her, but because it hurt to realize how close they had been to saving what they lost. He swallowed hard, eyes drawn to the pages he had once written and hidden. He confessed that he never meant for her to see it, that he'd written it in a moment of panic after one of their hardest conversations, trying to sort his feelings on paper when he couldn't speak them aloud. He admitted he hadn't known what to do after writing it, that shame and fear had kept him from handing it to her. He assumed it would get lost forever. Instead, it had arrived at exactly the moment when she needed to know the truth. She asked him the question that mattered most. Why had it been easier to write to a folded piece of paper than to her? There was no anger in her tone, only a deep, aching curiosity. He took a long breath, choosing honesty over self-protection. He told her about the house he'd grown up in, where emotions were carefully contained and vulnerability was treated like weakness, where his father believed that working hard and keeping problems to yourself was the definition of being a good man. No one had ever taught him how to say, "I'm afraid," or "I need you," or "you matter to me more than anything." So instead, he had tried to show it by fixing things, paying bills, being reliable, never realizing that to her, silence looked like absence. The truth loosened something in her. She had always suspected there was more beneath his quiet, but hearing it laid out like that made the invisible finally visible. Still, she knew that understanding the past did not automatically heal the hurt it caused. She told him honestly that there were nights she had gone to sleep, feeling like a placeholder in his life, days when she had felt lonelier with him than she did alone now. She said she could forgive him for not knowing how to speak his love, but she could not pretend those wounds hadn't formed. His shoulders sagged slightly at her words, but he didn't retreat. This time, he didn't reach for defense or explanation. Instead, he did the hardest thing he had ever done. He stayed present inside his own discomfort. He told her he was not asking for instant forgiveness, nor assuming they would fall back into old patterns. What he was asking for, if she could find it in her heart, was a chance to learn, truly learn, how to show her what he felt in ways that reached her. He said he was willing to get help, to go to therapy, to read, to practice, to embarrass himself stumbling over words he'd never been taught to say. He wasn't asking for her to carry the burden of his growth. He was asking for the opportunity to grow, with her as the person he chose to love. It was not a grand speech, but it was the most vulnerable he had ever been. The observer of destiny recognized it as the true climax, not the moment she left, but the moment he finally chose to step out from behind the wall he had hidden behind all his life. His persistence was not loud. It was in his willingness to change, to let his love become something she could actually feel. She stood very still, watching him, weighing not just his words, but the truth in his posture, his expression, the tremor in his voice. She realized that this was what she had wanted all along, not perfection, not poetic declarations, but effort that matched the depth of feeling he claimed to have. She didn't rush to answer. Instead, she stepped closer and told him that if they tried again, it would have to be different. They would need new rules, honest conversations. No more assuming the other should just know. She would have to forgive in stages. He would have to keep showing up even when it felt unnatural. He nodded, accepting every condition without hesitation. Then he did something small but remarkable for him. He reached for her hand, not out of habit, but as a conscious expression of what he could not fully articulate yet. His fingers were warm, tentative, She let her hand rest there, feeling both the familiarity and the newness of the gesture. In that quiet park, under an ordinary sky, they chose not to erase what had happened, but to build something new on the truth of it. The past could not be undone, but the story was not finished. And as they walked away side by side, not yet reconciled but no longer divided, Destiny understood that love, finally spoken, even in imperfect phrases, had begun to rewrite their ending. Weeks turned slowly into months, and what began as cautious meetings evolved into the patient rebuilding of something neither of them wanted to lose again. They did not rush. They went to counseling, sometimes stumbling through conversations that once would have sent them into silence. He learned to pause instead of retreating, to say words that felt awkward at first. I miss you. I'm worried. I love you. She learned to translate vulnerability as progress, not weakness, recognizing that every uncertain phrase was a step toward a love that was no longer hidden. Their time apart had left both humbled. He realized that devotion unspoken can still wound. She realized that love lived differently in different hearts, and that interpretation matters as much as intention. Together, they began creating new rituals, weekly walks, notes left in kitchen corners, check-ins where they asked not just how the day had gone, but how they each felt within it. The observer of destiny took quiet satisfaction in watching two people choose to remain teachable, even after pain. The turning point came not as an epiphany, but as an invitation. One afternoon he wrote a short message and sent it to her, simple and sincere. He asked if she would meet him at the park, where they had spoken honestly for the first time. She arrived curious, calm rather than anxious. When she reached the clearing, she saw him spreading a blanket under a tree, a picnic basket by his side. The scene was gentle, unpretentious. He looked up, smiled, a shy but intentional smile, and signed that he wanted to share a day built only for them. They sat together, surrounded by soft spring light and the distant sound of children playing. He had prepared foods he knew she loved, details he had paid attention to even before their separation. Between bites, he began to speak, not with rehearsed speeches, but with simple truth. He thanked her for coming back not out of nostalgia, but out of courage. He told her that choosing to stay with him now meant more than their wedding vows ever had, because this time it was rooted in understanding. Then, with careful breath, he shared something new. That writing the letter had been the first time he realized how much fear controlled his silence, and that since losing her, he had promised himself never again to let fear decide the fate of his heart. He didn't promise perfection, he promised presence, consistency. The willingness to speak even when uncertain, and to listen when she needed to be heard. It was his version of devotion, finally given words. She felt tears rise, not of sadness, but relief. She confessed that part of her had worried they would simply fall back into the patterns that had once broken them. But here, in this simple moment, this quiet picnic beneath a forgiving sky, she saw evidence of a different future. His vulnerability was no longer rare. It was becoming part of who he was. And for the first time, she believed that their love didn't have to be painful to be deep. They laughed more easily as the afternoon unfolded. He told small stories he had never shared before. She leaned against his shoulder, realizing that the steadiness she once admired had not disappeared. It had simply learned to coexist with expression. When the sun began to lower, casting warm light across the blanket, he reached for her hand deliberately, without hesitation, and told her that choosing her again felt like choosing home. They spoke softly about what had changed and what they wanted to guard moving forward. No more assumptions, no more emotional guessing games. If one felt unseen, it would be spoken. If one became afraid, it would be named. They would face misunderstanding together instead of separately. Destiny, observing with quiet grace, recognized the maturity in their agreement. They were not rewriting the past. They were honoring it by doing better because of it. As twilight deepened, they packed the basket, but lingered a moment longer under the tree. He looked at her with a steadiness that contained both gratitude and awe. Finally, he said aloud the words that had once seemed impossible, that he loved her deeply and irrevocably, and that he would spend the rest of his life learning how to say it in ways she could always feel. She smiled through tears, answered that she loved him too, and that this time she believed it without doubt. They walked home side by side, neither clinging nor hesitant, two people who had lost each other and found their way back, not through luck, but through humility, persistence, and truth spoken honestly. Their story did not end with silence. It transformed it into something that could finally hold love without hiding it. And as they stepped into their renewed life together, Destiny knew. The love he had never spoken had finally become the love they would both live by. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and leave a comment sharing your favorite moment. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell to receive alerts for new, romantic stories. Thank you for listening, and may your own story be filled with love.